At what point did we decide that the perfect Valentine's Day movie was the story of a commitment-phobic financier and a Hollywood Boulevard sex worker? Only the 90s could sell us this cocktail of rampant capitalism and prostitution as the ultimate fairy tale. While Edward, played by Richard Gere, calculated hostile takeovers with the warmth of an ice cube, Julia Roberts' Vivian could outshine his entire board of directors with a single laugh. And then there was Stuckey, the character who made half the world want to reach through the screen just to punch Jason Alexander. What began as a dark and gritty drama ended up mutating into a pop phenomenon that resurrected Roy Orbison and turned Rodeo Drive into an amusement park for anyone who's ever dreamed of screaming "big mistake" at a stuck-up salesperson. Get the popcorn ready. Here are the secrets of Pretty Woman that are better than a shopping spree on someone else's credit card. Number 15. It all started as a dark drama titled 3000, long before Disney turned it into a fairy tale. The origin of this classic is much murkier than you might imagine. If you thought Pretty Woman was the definition of ideal romance, think again. That original title wasn't a tender detail. It was the cold, hard price Edward paid for Vivian's services for a week. In this initial version written by J.F. Lawton, there was no trace of Hollywood magic. It was a sordid story about survival on the streets of Los Angeles. The original Vivian wasn't the charismatic young woman who captivated us, but a woman struggling with a serious drug addiction and an explosive temper. For his part, the Edward in that script wasn't a modern-day Prince Charming, but an icy, distant, and downright cruel man. Back then, love wasn't even on the radar. The original ending was a brutal dose of reality. Edward stopped the car in an alley, they argued, and he forcibly ejected her from the vehicle, throwing the bills at her before speeding off and leaving her alone on the asphalt. No limousines, no flowers, no epic rescues, just a woman watching the headlights of a car disappear into the darkness. The darkness didn't end there. Jeffrey Katzenberg, a former Disney executive, revealed that in one of the most extreme drafts, Vivian actually died of an overdose. It's a shocking contrast when you try to picture it, while the upbeat music of the shopping scenes plays. However, everything changed when Touchstone Pictures, a Disney label, acquired the project. The order was clear: turn that hell into a contemporary fairy tale. The script was rewritten 6 times, eliminating any trace of illicit substances, softening the protagonist's personalities, and injecting the humor we all know today. Julia Roberts herself remembers the original material as a dreadful and depressing story about 2 horrible people. Upon learning that Disney would produce the film, she even joked about whether they would make it animated. Luckily, director Gary Marshall took the reins and built the cultural phenomenon it is today. He traded the tragedy for Roy Orbison's legendary soundtrack and the bitterness for the iconic revenge on Rodeo Drive. That metamorphosis is the only reason you revisit the film today with a smile instead of remembering it as a traumatic social drama. It was the springboard that launched Julia Roberts to stardom, breathed new life into Richard Gere's career, and gave us the definitive line to shut down an arrogant salesman. Big mistake. Huge. Realism may have been in 3000, but immortality belonged to the fairy tale, because in the end, the stories that endure are the ones that allow us to believe in the impossible. Number 14. The film's massive success managed to reunite Roberts and Gere, even when critics weren't entirely convinced. If there's one thing almost everyone agreed on, even the harshest skeptics, it was that Julia Roberts and Richard Gere had electric chemistry. Audiences were completely sold. They packed theaters, cleaned out rental stores, and tuned in every single time it aired on TV. For the public, Pretty Woman wasn't some deep social commentary. It was just the pure joy of watching those two interact for 2 hours. Critics, however, were split. While some praised the performances and undeniable charm, others looked sideways at the fairy tale tropes and the glossy coat of wealth covering the plot. Hollywood, for its part, ignored the essays, looked at the box office numbers, and decided it needed a second helping. That is how, 9 years later, we ended up with Runaway Bride. That project had been floating around Hollywood for over a decade with names like Harrison Ford, Gina Davis, Michael Douglas, and Sandra Bullock attached at various points. But when the producers finally approached Gere, he had one non-negotiable condition: if you get Julia, I'm in. They got Julia, and audiences flocked to theaters to witness the reunion. In fact, Runaway Bride actually surpassed Pretty Woman's box office earnings. Even though critics remained indifferent, nobody really cared. People just wanted to see Roberts and Gere together again, and Gary Marshall gave them exactly what they asked for, including, of course, the legendary Hector Elizondo. It wasn't an accident or some sentimental coincidence. That reunion happened because Pretty Woman proved that putting these two on the same screen was a guaranteed goldmine, regardless of what the intellectuals had to say about the film's message. Number 13. Pretty Woman was the film that officially crowned Julia Roberts as a true movie star. It wasn't that she came out of nowhere, but this was the role that cemented her status as an icon. Before Vivian, she was just a talented actress popping up in a few interesting projects. After Vivian, she became the sole reason people bought a ticket. This role allowed her to unload her entire arsenal of talent all at once. She had free rein to be hilarious, heartbreaking, furious at snobby saleswomen, or incredibly vulnerable in an elevator. It was a messy, intense, and utterly genuine performance in the best possible way, and audiences didn't just like it, they fell head over heels. The industry took notice instantly. Suddenly, she wasn't just a member of the cast, she was the movie. Studios started greenlighting entire projects based on a single question. What if we put Julia Roberts in this situation? In fact, half the romantic comedies of the 90s were just attempts to bottle that same lightning, usually just swapping out the costumes. While the fictional Vivian earned a week in a luxury penthouse and a man who finally found his heart, the real-life Julia Roberts earned an entire decade of blockbusters and her face on every billboard in the mall. It's pretty clear which of those two rewards turned out to be more lucrative in the long run. It was the birth of America's Sweetheart, a title she held for years thanks to a blend of charisma and naturalness that nobody has ever quite been able to replicate. Number 12. Laura San Giacomo basically achieved the impossible by owning every scene as Kit with minimal screen time. Kit DeLuca is on screen for barely as long as a commercial, yet she's a character no one ever forgets. What San Giacomo did was essentially a professional heist, stealing scenes from the entire main cast. Kit could have easily been a flat stereotype, the bad influence, the comic relief, or just a walking cliché in fishnets designed to make Vivian look more refined by comparison. Instead, San Giacomo gave her a gritty, overwhelming humanity. She played her as a real woman who, despite making some tough choices, stays fiercely loyal to her friend when it counts. She's witty, sharp-tongued, and doesn't sugarcoat the harsh realities of their lifestyle. Every time Kit bursts onto the screen, the movie gets a much-needed reality check. She's the living reminder that Vivian's dream has an expiration date. She represents the world Vivian would have to crawl back to if the week ended as grimly as the original script intended. Both critics and talent scouts were blown away. With barely 15 minutes of total screen time, San Giacomo captivated the audience and launched a career full of new projects. While Vivian got the prince and the fairy tale, Kit earned the audience's respect and delivered some of the film's most iconic lines. She turned a supporting role into the movie's emotional anchor, proving that even in a Beverly Hills penthouse, street smarts carry a lot of weight. Number 11. The movie poster is a complete fabrication. You surely have that famous image of Pretty Woman etched in your mind. Julia Roberts leaning against Richard Gere, both looking like they just stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. Well, almost nothing you see there is real. Let's start with Julia. Her face is there, of course, but from the neck down, the story changes. Someone in the marketing department decided the actress's body wasn't poster-worthy enough. And so they pulled off a classic Hollywood magic trick. They grafted Roberts' head onto the body of her double, Shelley Michelle, and called it a day. And then there's Richard Gere. If you watch the actual film, his hair is naturally gray, almost silver in certain lighting. However, on the promotional poster, it's jet black. An editor decided he needed a digital dye job that, oddly enough, didn't match what audiences actually saw on the big screen. In short, the two people selling the film on that poster aren't technically the ones who appear in the movie. One is a head transplant, and the other went through a non-existent digital hair salon. It's the visual equivalent of a fake dating app profile, but somehow it worked so well that it became one of the most iconic images in cinema history. Number 10. Roy Orbison's classic, Oh. A Pretty Woman experienced a completely unexpected second youth. Orbison didn't exactly need a hit in 1990. The song was already legendary, but the film gifted him a comeback tour that no one saw coming. The most ironic part is how the context shifted. Orbison's original lyrics are just about a guy watching a woman walk down the street and wishing she'd turn around. It's essentially a musical compliment powered by a masterful guitar riff. However, the film took that same melody and flipped it into an anthem of liberation. When that track kicks in, we see Vivian strutting through Hollywood like she owns the place. A song born from male desire suddenly became an ode to personal empowerment. By taking the song's title as its own, the movie linked the two forever in our collective imagination. The second you hear that first chord, you know exactly what universe you're in. It's not a gritty drama about rampant capitalism anymore. It's a fun, loud, and slightly ridiculous experience in the best possible way. When the film became a smash hit, the song became its inseparable sidekick. Radio stations played it nonstop, compilation albums rescued it from the archives, and an entire generation that had barely heard of Orbison ended up learning every single note. Today, it's impossible to separate the two. You hear that opening riff, and you don't just think of 60s rock. You picture Vivian in her thigh-high boots and blonde wig, taking over a Hollywood that the narrator of the original song could only watch from the sidewalk. Now, let's keep the count going with number 9. Number 9. The hotel manager wasn't originally destined to be Vivian's fairy godmother. Barney, the man running the Regent Beverly Wilshire, could have easily been the antagonist who spends the entire movie trying to kick her out. Instead, he becomes the silent ally who makes sure she stays, and that shift wasn't exactly in the initial plans. On paper, Barney started out as a polite but strict gatekeeper, the kind of guy who enforces the rules, keeps the wealthy guests happy, and treats anyone who doesn't fit the mold as a problem. He's the type of character you've seen in 100 movies and whose name you can never quite remember. But director Gary Marshall had a secret weapon, Hector Elizondo. The two actually met on a basketball court back in 1979, when Elizondo accidentally hit Marshall in the face with a bad pass. Marshall's response was legendary. "That pass was awful, but you're a fantastic actor. I've got a movie for you." From that moment on, Elizondo appeared in every single one of the 18 films Marshall directed between 1982 and 2016. Marshall knew exactly what Elizondo could bring to a role like Barney, and the actor didn't disappoint. He played him as someone calm, kind, and quietly amused by the whole situation, which made the plot flow so much better. Instead of being another hurdle to clear, Barney becomes the authority figure who decides Vivian deserves a chance. He helps her with etiquette, keeps the staff in line, and guides her through social minefields without ever being condescending. By the end of the film, he's essentially a fairy godmother. He doesn't wave a wand to conjure a dress, but he opens doors that should have stayed shut and makes sure she walks through them feeling like she belongs. In a movie full of people who judge Vivian at first glance, Barney is the only one who bothers to look twice. Number 8. The iconic laugh while watching I Love Lucy was actually triggered by tickling. Julia Roberts' laugh is practically its own character in this movie. It's explosive, infectious, and in at least one key scene, it was handcrafted by Gary Marshall. In the sequence where Vivian is sitting on the floor watching TV and loses it, that hysterical reaction didn't just happen on its own. Marshall needed her to truly let loose. He wasn't looking for a polite giggle or a staged movie laugh. He wanted a genuine belly laugh that takes your breath away. So he did what any reasonable director would do. He positioned himself off-screen, out of sight of the camera, and started tickling her feet. The trick worked perfectly. Roberts couldn't contain herself, and that raw, chaotic moment is exactly what ended up in the final cut. When you watch that scene, you aren't really seeing Vivian laughing at an old sitcom. You're seeing Julia Roberts trying her best not to kick her director in the face. Sometimes the greatest performances are born from profound emotional breakthroughs. Other times they come from a grown man ambushing his leading lady's feet like a deranged uncle at a family dinner. We're officially halfway through the countdown. If you're still with me, I'm guessing Pretty Woman has lived on a VHS tape, a DVD, or a digital playlist in your house at some point. Tell me in the comments how you first saw it. Did you rent it from a video store or record it off the TV on a 180-minute tape? And while you're down there, hit like and subscribe so we can keep digging up these movie memories. Number 7, the red dress and the jewelry box. Two iconic moments that almost didn't exist. The red dress is probably the definitive image of Pretty Woman. It's on desserts, on DVD covers, and has been replicated on thousands of costumes and prom dresses. But of course, they almost ruined it. In the early wardrobe meetings, other styles were considered. softer colors that would have made Vivian seem sweeter than imposing, or cool tones that would have camouflaged her in Edward's world instead of making her stand out were valid choices for another film, but not for this one. By opting for that intense, saturated red, they transform the night at the opera into a true coronation. When she appears, both the characters and the audience have to recalibrate their gaze. She's no longer the girl in high boots from the beginning. She's the same person. But now, her outward appearance reflects the presence she always possessed. And then there's the famous jewelry box scene. In the script, it was the typical millionaire gives an incredibly expensive jewel. He opens the box, she's amazed, romantic music plays. You know the drill. It would have been a nice scene, but nothing we hadn't seen in any other ballroom movie. However, on set, Richard Gere thought everything was going a little too perfectly. As Julia leaned in to look at the necklace, he slammed the box shut, trapping her fingers. She let out a little squeal and then burst into that totally natural, unfiltered laugh we all know. There was no rehearsal or character building. It was simply Julia being the victim of a joke. Gary Marshall saw the footage and knew he'd never get anything better. He scrapped the polished version of the script and kept the take of the joke. That improvised moment became one of the defining images of the film, appearing in every trailer and compilation for the past 30 years. Number 7, the red dress and the jewelry box. We're talking about two iconic moments that almost never happened. The red dress is arguably the definitive image of Pretty Woman. It's on posters, DVD covers, and has been replicated in countless prom dresses and costumes, but the studio almost ruined it. During early wardrobe meetings, they considered other styles, softer colors to make Vivian seem sweeter, or cool tones meant to help her blend into Edward's world. Those might have worked for a different movie, but not this one. By choosing that intense, unsaturated red, they turned a night at the opera into a literal coronation. When she finally steps out, the audience has to do a double take. She isn't just the girl in thigh-high boots anymore. She's the same person, but now her clothes finally match the presence she's had all along. Then there's the famous jewelry box scene. In the script, it was a standard millionaire gives expensive gift moment. He opens the box, she looks amazed, romantic music swells, you know the drill. It would have been a fine scene, but nothing we hadn't seen before. On set, however, Richard Gere felt things were getting a bit too polished. As Julia leaned in to get a closer look at the necklace, he suddenly snapped the box shut, catching her fingers. She let out a little squeal and burst into that totally natural, unfiltered laugh we all love. There was no rehearsal and no acting involved. It was just Julia Roberts reacting to a prank. Gary Marshall saw the footage and knew he'd never get anything better. He tossed the perfect scripted version and kept the joke. That improvised second became one of the film's most famous images, featured in every trailer and montage for the last 30 years. Number 5. If you already think Jason Alexander's Philip Stuckey is a repulsive character, congratulations, you're right. The funny thing is, this is actually the toned-down version. In the darkest drafts of the story, Stuckey was far more predatory and cruel. He was less of a scheming lawyer and more of a genuine human nightmare. His behavior pushed the film into such raw drama that instead of popcorn, you would have needed therapy after watching it. Oh, as the movie shifted toward a more romantic tone, the team realized that this level of depravity just didn't fit. They needed a villain, not a trauma warning. That's why the most gruesome moments were cut, though they were never entirely erased. Stuckey remains that specific type of creep who turns menacing the moment he senses Vivian is disrupting his perfect business deal. That scene is still intentionally deeply uncomfortable, but it doesn't derail the film's fairy tale mode. Jason Alexander plays him perfectly, calculating and helpful to his clients, but vicious the second he thinks no one is watching. He's exactly the kind of man Vivian has been dodging her whole life, and the ideal subject for Edward to finally punch in the face. The film needed a villain you wouldn't feel bad about hating, and they certainly delivered. Number 4. Richard Gere almost quit acting right before Pretty Woman came along. On screen, Gere looks so comfortable as Edward that he seems like he was born wearing a $1,000 suit. However, the reality is that just before this shoot, he was seriously questioning whether he even wanted to stay in the business. His career had cooled off considerably in the late 80s. His latest projects hadn't exactly set the world on fire, and the roles he was being offered didn't excite him in the slightest. When he first received the script, Millionaire Hires a Girl for a Week of Luxury, he didn't immediately see a career resurrection written on the page. What really hooked him wasn't the romantic fantasy, but the emotional block of ice that Edward represented. He was drawn to the idea of a character so closed off that he doesn't even know what he's feeling, only beginning to wake up because someone refuses to play by his rules. Gary Marshall pushed him to give Edward a real inner life, instead of just being a handsome man in a tie. Between that acting challenge and the energy Julia Roberts was bringing to the project, he decided to sign on. The result was monumental. The film was a massive success. Edward became one of his most iconic roles, and suddenly, Gere was back at the top of Hollywood's A-list. Not bad for a job he almost turned down while mentally packing his bags for retirement. Number 3. Julia Roberts wasn't the first choice to play Vivian. Today, it seems impossible to imagine anyone else in the role, but the casting process was a real ordeal of rejections. Molly Ringwald passed on the project, as did Michelle Pfeiffer. McCann said no. Daryl Hahn even flatly refused, calling the script misogynistic and degrading to women. Before Julia came along, Vivian had serious trouble finding someone to play her. When the script was still dark and depressing, Vivian wasn't the whirlwind of charisma and witty one-liners we know today. She was written as a walking tragedy, which led the producers to search for actresses capable of selling that heavy, dramatic version. The role wasn't that of a prostitute with a heart of gold, but rather a victim of the system. It wasn't exactly the ideal energy for a dating movie. However, as the script was polished, jokes were introduced, the ending softened, and the story evolved into an urban fairy tale. Suddenly, they no longer needed a symbol of despair. They needed someone the audience would want to follow for 2 hours as she ran rings around uptight people with a smile. That's where Julia Roberts came in. At that point, the film needed exactly what she did best: big emotions, even bigger laughs, and zero shame about looking ridiculous if it served the scene better. Once she signed on, the character of Vivian fit her naturally: funny, vulnerable, and unpredictable. The wardrobe changed, the dialogue became more fluid, and the entire film began to revolve around her. No, it wasn't the original plan, but it was the version of the plan that transformed Pretty Woman from a small, interesting drama into a classic that will live forever on our screens. Number 2. The original ending was such a resounding failure that they had to completely rebuild it from scratch. That iconic scene of Edward in the limousine, roses in hand, climbing the fire escape like it was his personal Mount Everest, seems like the only logical conclusion today. However, originally, that entire sequence didn't even exist. The film used to just cut off abruptly. In the initial cut, Edward paid Vivian, they said goodbye, and that was it. There was no limousine circling the block, no declarations of love shouted from the sidewalk, and no speech about rescuing each other. One version even showed Vivian and Kit on a bus, driving away with the money toward a life that was maybe slightly better than the streets, but still steeped in a pretty depressing realism. Test audiences absolutely hated it. They had just spent 2 hours watching these two characters tear down each other's defenses, only for the film to essentially tell them, "Thanks for coming. Have a nice trip." The feedback cards were unanimous. People wanted to know why the movie stopped there. The audience wanted romance, they wanted a grand gesture, and they wanted something much bigger than a simple good luck and goodbye. Faced with this reaction, the studio hit the panic button. They recalled the cast, built the famous fire escape, and stitched together a new ending. Director Gary Marshall later admitted that by that point, they weren't shooting a gritty social drama anymore. They were creating a fairy tale, and the original ending didn't fit the movie they had actually made. Without those disastrous test screenings, Pretty Woman would have ended with a shrug. Instead, we got one of the most memorable endings of the 90s. Featuring a billionaire who's terrified of heights, clinging to rusty metal for love. Finally, we end our countdown with number 1. Number 1, Rodeo Drive. From a stage for real-life snobbery to a global tourist attraction, Vivian's shopping humiliation remains one of cinema's most satisfying moments, because we all know the revenge is coming. Vivian is scrutinized, scorned, and practically escorted out for the crime of not looking wealthy enough. That scene is so impactful because, to no one's surprise, that attitude wasn't made up. When the production tried to film on the real Rodeo Drive, several luxury boutiques were openly hostile. They didn't want their brands associated with a movie about a sex worker, no matter how much Disney was softening the story into a romantic fantasy. Permits were denied, and meetings ended coldly. Faced with this rejection, the team sought out stores willing to collaborate and decided to capitalize on the disdain already in the air. That barely concealed contempt the saleswomen direct at Vivian on screen didn't require much acting. It came from a very real place. All of this makes her triumphant return, with the iconic line about their big, huge mistake, even more gratifying. You're watching the film transform the very real classism of that street into a revenge fantasy laden with luxury handbags. The most ironic part happened afterward. As soon as the film became a massive hit, those same boutiques changed their minds overnight. Rodeo Drive quietly transformed into the Pretty Woman experience. Tourists began arriving en masse to follow Vivian's path, stand where she was rejected, parade along the sidewalk, and pose in front of any window that resembled the one in the film while reciting the famous line. In the end, tourism proved that money knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next roundup of movie secrets, and tell us in the comments what other film you'd like us to analyze. See you next time.